there is a moment, a very specific, very nauseating moment, that several homeowners in Birchwood Commons have described in almost identical terms. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when a moving truck idled at the curb of 14 Sycamore Ridge Lane. A woman named Darlene Fitch stood on her front lawn with a clipboard, a tape measure, the unmistakable energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. The truck did not belong to someone moving in. It belonged to someone moving out. And Darlene Fitch, President of the Birchwood Commons Community Association, was there to supervise, or more precisely, to inventory, the belongings being loaded into it. Because as far as Darlene was concerned, the home at 14 Sycamore Ridge Lane, its contents, its driveway, and possibly the blue Subaru Outback parked in it, all belonged to her community now. The homeowner, Marcus Webb, had not been consulted on this point. Marcus was, at that moment, sitting in an airport gate in Phoenix, Arizona, watching his connecting flight get canceled, staring at his phone, and reading a text from his next-door neighbor, Priya Okonkwo, that said, "Marcus, come home, now." She called 911 and told them, "You abandoned the property. Your stuff is on the lawn." He read it twice. Then he read the follow-up message, which said, "She has a clipboard, Marcus. She is writing things down." Marcus Webb had been a homeowner at 14 Sycamore Ridge Lane for 6 years. He had paid his HOA dues on time, every quarter, without exception. He had painted his shutters the board-approved shade of Chesapeake gray. He had replaced his mailbox post, also board-approved, after a snowplow clipped it in February of 2021. He had never, not once, received a formal notice of violation from the Birchwood Commons Community Association, until 8 months earlier, when Darlene Fitch moved in next door. Drop your city right now, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many of you are watching this from behind enemy lines. Birchwood Commons sits in the eastern suburbs of fictional Hargrove, Ohio, a development of 2 forts single-family homes built in 2 phases between 1998 and 2003. The homes are brick-fronted colonials and center hall Tudors, arranged along curved streets with names like Sycamore Ridge, Heather Hollow, Copperfield Court. The landscaping is mature. The driveways are sealed. The streets are quiet in the way that only certain American suburbs manage. The kind of quiet that is maintained not by peace, but by effort. The Birchwood Commons Community Association governs those 214 homes under a set of CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, restrictions, that run to 61 pages, not including the Architectural Guidelines Addendum, which is another 22. The CC&Rs were last formally amended in 2019, when the board voted to allow natural wood grain garage doors as an alternative to the previously mandatory white steel. It was, by all accounts, a historic moment. The 5-member board of the Birchwood Commons Community Association was, for most of its existence, a rotating group of reasonably normal people who met 6 times a year to discuss the reserve fund, the pool maintenance contract, and the occasional complaint about someone's basketball hoop. Marcus Webb had served on the board himself for 2 years, from 2019 to 2021, handling the Architectural Review Committee. He left voluntarily because his job, software project manager at a mid-size logistics company, required travel. He could not reliably make every meeting. He was replaced in the autumn of 2021 by a man named Gerald Toombs. Gerald was fine. What happened in January of the following year was not Gerald's doing and, arguably, not anyone's fault in the traditional sense, except possibly the fault of whichever real estate agent sold the house at 16 Sycamore Ridge Lane to Darlene Fitch. Darlene Fitch was 54 years old. She was recently divorced, recently relocated from Scottsdale, Arizona, and, as she told the Birchwood Commons welcome committee at the neighborhood mixer held in her honor, in February, she was very excited to get involved. She had served on 3 HOA boards in Arizona. She had chaired an architectural committee. She had, and this she mentioned unprompted, once successfully lobbied to have a resident's entire backyard redesigned after the resident installed a pergola zero. 6 inches taller than the maximum permitted height under the Scottsdale Area Community's CC&Rs. The welcome committee smiled and poured more wine. By April, Darlene had been elected to the Birchwood Commons Community Association Board, filling a vacancy left by the resignation of Treasurer Melinda Park, who cited personal reasons but who was later observed at a neighborhood cookout, describing Darlene as the kind of person who alphabetizes her spice rack and then reports you for not alphabetizing yours. Darlene became vice president in June, following a procedural vote that Gerald Toombs later admitted he did not fully understand he was participating in. Marcus Webb noticed none of this, because Marcus Webb was in Denver for 6 weeks running a platform migration for a client, because, in his experience, Birchwood Commons board politics had all the drama of a dentist's waiting room. That was still true, for a while. The first violation notice arrived at 14 Sycamore Ridge Lane on September 9th of that year. It was delivered by certified mail, struck Marcus as unusual, since the board had previously sent all violation notices by regular post or email. He signed for it on a Thursday morning before a 7 a.m. flight to Charlotte. The notice cited Section 4.7 of the Birchwood Commons CC&Rs, exterior storage and equipment visibility. Specifically, it alleged that Marcus had left a garden hose reel visible from the street on the right side of his property, in violation of the requirement that all garden equipment be stored within an enclosed structure or screened from public view when not in active use. The fine was $75. Marcus stood in his driveway, rolling bag at his feet, and looked at the hose reel. It was a black, retractable reel, mounted to the side of the house on a bracket, approximately 8 inches from the corner of the garage. He had installed it in 2019. He had submitted an architectural modification request for it at the time, Form AM3, signed and dated, and received approval. He had the email. He took a photo of the hose reel. He took a photo of the approval email. He typed a brief, polite response, attached both, and sent it to the HOA management company, Midland Property Services, with a note that he believed the matter was resolved by the prior written approval and requested confirmation that the fine be voided. He did this on his phone, in the Uber, on the way to the airport. He did not consider it a significant event. Now that you know Marcus, has your HOA ever sent you a notice over something you already had approved? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has ever done. I want to read every single one. The fine was not voided. Midland Property Services sent a form letter 11 days later, acknowledging his response and stating that the matter had been referred back to the board's Architectural Review Committee for further consideration. No timeline was given. The $75 fine remained on his account, accruing a $15 per month administrative fee for each month it went unpaid. Marcus called Midland. He was placed on hold for 22 minutes and then connected to a representative named Tyler, who could not locate the original 2019 approval in their records and suggested Marcus resubmit the modification request if he believed one had been filed. Marcus resubmitted Form AM3. He attached the original email approval again. He mailed a physical copy to Midland's office by certified mail. He noted in the cover letter that he was disputing the fine under Section 12.3 of the CC&Rs, which provided a formal dispute resolution process for contested violations. 2 weeks later, he received a second violation notice. This one cited Section 4.12's lawn and landscape maintenance, specifically that the grass on the south side of his property, adjacent to the shared fence line with 16 Sycamore Ridge Lane, Darlene Fitch's property, had been measured at 4.2 inches in height, exceeding the maximum permitted length of 4 inches under the current lawn maintenance standards, a supplemental policy adopted by the board in August. The fine was $125. Marcus did not own a ruler calibrated to the 10th of an inch. He did own a standard tape measure, which he used the following Saturday morning to measure his grass at 7 different points along the south fence line. The average was 3.8 inches. The highest single measurement was 4.1 inches, at the base of a sprinkler head where the turf was slightly elevated. He mowed anyway. He photographed the mowing. He sent the photographs to Midland with a second dispute letter. The third violation notice arrived 19 days later. Section 5.2a, Holiday and Seasonal Decorations. Marcus had left a small autumn wreath, 11 inches in diameter, dried wheat stalks, no lighting, on his front door past the permitted display period for seasonal non-lighting decorations, which the board had, and a resolution passed at the October meeting, retroactively limited to 30 days from the first day of the season. The wreath had been up for 33 days. The fine was $150. Marcus removed the wreath. He disputed the fine on the grounds that the 30-day limitation represented a policy change that had not been communicated to residents prior to enforcement, and that retroactive application violated the notice provisions of Section 2.1 of the CC&Rs, which required 45 days written notice before any new enforcement policy took effect. He was, by this point, keeping a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet had columns for date, violation number, section cited, fine amount, administrative fees accrued, dispute letter sent, response received, and notes. The notes column was growing. He had also quietly begun attending board meetings. The Birchwood Commons Community Association held its regular meetings on the third Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m., the lower meeting room of the Hargrove Community Center on Millbrook Road. Attendance among non-board residents was, historically, sparse. Marcus had attended perhaps 4 meetings in 6 years. He showed up to the November meeting and found 9 other residents already seated, which was 9 more than usual. He recognized several of them. Priya Okonkwo from across the street, Tom Halstead from the cul-de-sac on Heather Hollow, a couple he did not know who introduced themselves as the Garcias from Copperfield Court and who were, they explained in the parking lot beforehand, on their 4th violation notice in 6 weeks. The meeting was called to order by Board President Greg Whitmore, a soft-spoken, retired insurance adjuster who had held the position for 3 years, who, in Marcus's estimation, had gradually come to resemble a man sitting in the passenger seat of a car being driven by someone he was afraid to. Asked to slow down. Darlene Fitch sat to Greg's left. She had a binder. The binder was thick. Marcus watched Darlene Fitch during that November meeting with the focused attention of a man who had spent 2 months disputing violations he did commit and was only now beginning to understand the architecture of what was happening to him. She spoke precisely. She cited section numbers from memory. When Tom Halstead raised a question about the new lawn measurement policy, she produced a copy of the August resolution, the enabling authority in Section 8.4 of the CC&Rs, printed copy of the Ohio Planned Community Act, tabbed in 3 places. She was not improvising. She had built something. She had been building it since before Marcus received his first violation notice. What Marcus did not know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that Darlene Fitch had, in the 5 months since joining the board, submitted 27 formal complaints against properties within a 2-block radius of 16 Sycamore Ridge Lane. 24 of those complaints had been filed against a single address, 14 Sycamore Ridge Lane. He would learn this February. The 4th, 5th, 6th violation notices arrived between December and January. Section 6(d), a downspout extension on the rear of the property allegedly directing water flow toward the shared fence line. Fine, $200. Section 4(7). Again, the hose reel, still mounted, still previously approved. Fine now $250 due to repeat violation multiplier. Section 9.3a. Crack in the driveway apron defined as a structural maintenance deficiency. Fine. Total outstanding fines with administrative fees, 1,247. The dispute letters were no longer receiving individual responses. Midland Property Services sent a single consolidated letter in January stating that the board had reviewed Marcus's disputes and found them without merit, that the fines remained due, that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a lien being placed against the property under Section 14(2) of the CC&Rs. Marcus hired an attorney. Her name was Carla Diaz. She practiced community association law out of an office in downtown Hargrove, and she had, 15 years, seen most varieties of HOA dysfunction. She reviewed Marcus's spreadsheet, his photographs, his dispute letters, Midland's responses, and the board resolutions underlying each violation notice. She was quiet for a long time after she finished reading. She said, "Someone on this board is filing these complaints. They're not coming from anonymous resident submissions. The filing timestamps and the specificity of the measurements are too consistent. Has anyone been watching your property?" Marcus thought about the first violation notice, about the tape measure, about the word measured. He said, "My next-door neighbor just joined the board." Carla Diaz said, "Okay." She said it, the way a doctor says okay when they've just confirmed what the test results already suggested. She filed a formal records request under Birchwood Commons Community Association's own CC&Rs, Section 13.1, which required the board to make all complaint records, board meeting minutes, financial records available to any member of the association upon written request. She also sent a demand letter to Midland Property Services, disputing all 6 outstanding fines on the grounds of procedural deficiency, selective enforcement, and violation of the prior written approval for the hose reel modification. The records arrived in 3 batches over 6 weeks, and they were illuminating. Between April and January, Darlene Fitch had submitted 31 complaints to the Birchwood Commons Community Association's violation reporting system. 26 of them were against 14 Sycamore Ridge Lane. The remaining 5 were scattered across 3 other properties and appeared, when mapped against public records, to be homes owned by residents who had voted against Darlene's election to the board, or who had raised objections, board meetings. The complaints against Marcus's property included a photo in every case. The photos were taken from angles consistent with the property line between 14 and 16 Sycamore Ridge Lane, meaning from Darlene Fitch's yard, Darlene Fitch's eye level, with timestamps that clustered in the early morning and late afternoon, the hours before and after a standard workday. She had been watching his house, methodically, obsessively. She had been documenting it since the day she joined the board. Over $1, $2.47 in manufactured fines against Marcus Webb. Is what she did legal where you live? What would you have done? Carla Diaz was not finished. She cross-referenced the complaint records with the board meeting minutes, specifically the minutes from the June meeting at which Darlene Fitch had been elected vice president and the August meeting at which the new lawn maintenance standards had been adopted. In both cases, the meeting minutes listed the vote as 3-1 in favor. The quorum requirement under Section 7.2 of the CC&Rs was 3 board members present. At both meetings, 3 members were listed as present, which meant the votes had passed at the absolute minimum quorum. And in both cases, Gerald Toombs, the one dissenting vote, had later told Marcus in the parking lot after the November meeting that he hadn't fully understood what he was voting on. Carla Diaz wrote a letter to the board. It ran to 11 pages. The letter cited Section 10.4 of the CC&Rs, which defines the selective enforcement and its remedies. It cited Section 3.2, prohibited board members which from using their authority for personal purposes, unrelated to the collective governance of the community. It cited Ohio Revised Code 5312.12, governing the obligations of planned community associations and the rights of unit owners to challenge improper enforcement actions. It cited the terms of the original 2019 architectural modification approval, which constituted a binding written agreement between Marcus and the association under general contract principles applicable to covenant enforcement, demanded the voiding of all 6 violation notices and all associated fees. It demanded a formal written acknowledgement that the hose reel installation was approved, demanded disclosure of the complaint filing records for all properties in Birchwood Commons for the previous 12 months, just Marcus's address. and it gave the board 30 days to respond before Carla Diaz filed a complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's office, initiated a civil action in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. The board's response, delivered through Midland Property Services 28 days later, was no. Not a detailed no, not a legal no, just no. 2 paragraphs acknowledging receipt and declining to void the fines or provide additional records, citing ongoing board deliberation and legal privilege for the complaint records. A claim that Carla Diaz described to Marcus as creative fiction, given that complaint records submitted by board members to the association's own management company had never, in the history of Ohio HOA law, protected by any form of legal privilege. Marcus authorized Carla to file the AG complaint. He also did something else. He knocked on doors. Not every door in Birchwood Commons, 214 homes, that would have taken weeks. But he started with the 9 people who had been at the November board meeting, and he asked each of them a simple question. Had they received violation notices in the past 12 months? And if so, when did the notices start? The answers were instructive. Tom Halstead, 4 notices since October, starting 3 weeks after he seconded a procedural objection at the September meeting. The first meeting, Darlene Fitch tended as a board member. The Garcias, 5 notices since November, first one arriving 9 days after Carlos Garcia emailed the board to ask questions about the new lawn standards. Priya Okonkwo, 2 notices in December, both involving her side yard, which faced Darlene Fitch's back fence. Marcus added a second tab to his spreadsheet. By the time he was done canvassing, he had spoken to 22 residents, who had received a combined total of 67 violation notices in the previous 10 months. 41 of those notices had been issued to properties within a 4-block radius of Sycamore Ridge Lane. 33 of them had been issued to residents who had, in some documented way, expressed skepticism about, voted against, publicly questioned Darlene Fitch. Marcus compiled everything into a 30-page document. He sent a copy to Carla Diaz. He sent a copy to the Hargrove Courier, the local paper, to a reporter named Jess Farrell, who covered municipal and community affairs. He sent a copy to Birchwood Commons Community Association's board. All 5 members individually, their personal email addresses, with a cover note that was polite, factual, and precisely 3 sentences long. Marcus Webb just made a critical move. He sent that 30-page document directly to a local reporter. Right call? What's your strategy? Would you have gone to the media or handled this differently? Tell me in the comments. Jess Farrell called Marcus the following Tuesday morning. She had read the document. She had cross-referenced the violation records he'd provided with the board meeting minutes, which were public record. She had also, on her own initiative, pulled the Birchwood Commons Community Association's IRS 990 filing. HOA associations above a certain income threshold were required to file, and noticed that the association's management contract with Midland Property Services had been renegotiated in September, 2 months after Darlene Fitch joined the board. The new contract was for a higher annual fee. It included a performance incentive clause tied to violation fine collections. She asked Marcus if he knew about the incentive clause. Marcus did not know about the incentive clause. He called Carla Diaz. Carla Diaz said, "Send me the 990. Performance incentive clause in Midland Property Services revised contract stipulated that the management company would receive a 15% administrative fee on all fines collected above a baseline threshold of $5,000 annually, the prior year's total. In the 10 months since the contract revision, Birchwood Commons had issued violation fines totaling $21,400 across the community. Midland's incentive fee on collections above the $5,000 baseline, $2,460. The revised contract had been approved at the August board meeting, the same meeting at which the new lawn maintenance standards were adopted. The same meeting with 3-member quorum. The same meeting Gerald Toombs didn't fully understand. Carla Diaz amended the age complaint to include a claim under Ohio Revised Code 5312.09, which governed conflicts of interest and financial arrangements involving planned community association managers. She also added a count under Section 3.2 of the CC&Rs alleging that Darlene Fitch, in her capacity as vice president and in her role soliciting the contract revision, had violated her fiduciary duty to the association's members. The Ohio AG's office opened a preliminary inquiry within 2 weeks. Jess Farrell's article ran on a Thursday. The headline was, "Birchwood Commons Homeowners. HOA Vice President Weaponized Complaint System Against Neighbors. Records Show." It was accompanied by a sidebar with a chart of the violation notices, by property address, by date, and by proximity to the complainant's address. The chart was not subtle. The article was shared 4,200 times in the first 48 hours. It was picked up by 2 Columbus TV stations. Clip from one of the stations was shared on 3 separate HOA-focused subreddits, where it accumulated approximately 60,000 upvotes and a comment thread that could generously be described as thorough. Darlene Fitch did not respond to the Courier's requests for comment. Greg Whitmore, board president, a statement through Midland Property Services saying the board took the concerns seriously and was conducting an internal review. Gerald Toombs, reached by Jess Farrell at his home on Heather Hollow Drive, said, and this quote ran in the paper without editing, "I honestly didn't know what most of those votes were for. She just kind of explained them fast and then called the vote. I thought I was approving mulch colors." It was not mulch colors, Gerald. The board scheduled an emergency special meeting for the following Wednesday. Notice was sent to all 214 property owners. This was technically procedural violation in itself. Section 7.6 required 10 days notice for special meetings. Notice went out 8 days in advance. But under the circumstances, nobody was filing a violation notice about it. 89 residents showed up. The lower meeting room at the Hargrove Community Center held, at maximum occupancy, 63 people. The fire marshal had opinions about this, but the fire marshal was not present. The hallway filled. People stood in the stairwell. Someone propped the exterior door open, and a group of residents listened from the parking lot in 38-degree weather. Marcus Webb sat in the second row, next to Carla Diaz, next to Priya Okonkwo, next to Tom Halstead, next to the Garcias, next to 11 other residents who had brought their violation notices in manila folders and stacked them on the table in front of them like evidence, which is precisely what they were. Darlene Fitch arrived 7 minutes late. She was dressed in a blazer. She had her binder. She sat down and opened it and looked at the room with the expression of someone who has decided, at a fundamental level, the room is wrong and she is right, and who intends to maintain this position regardless of what the room has to say. Greg Whitmore called the meeting to order. His voice was slightly unsteady. The first item on the agenda was public comment. What followed was 2 hours and 14 minutes of public comment. Tom Halstead presented a timeline of his violation notices mapped against his attendance at board meetings and found a correlation coefficient that, as he pointed out, calculated using a spreadsheet his daughter helped him build. Mrs. Eleanor Voss, 71 years old, from Copperfield Court, stood up and read her violation notice aloud in full, cited Section 4.1, lawn height, $125 fine, and then informed the board that she had stage 2 osteoarthritis in both knees and mowed her lawn with a push mower every 10 days because she could not afford a service and had never in 14 years of living in Birchwood Commons received a single violation notice until Darlene Fitch moved in, at which point she received 3 and 2 months. The room was very quiet while Mrs. Voss spoke. Carlos Garcia presented the 30-page document Marcus had compiled. He had brought copies for the board. He placed one in front of each board member. He placed one in front of Darlene Fitch last. He held it there a half-second longer than necessary before setting it down. Carla Diaz addressed the board in her capacity as legal counsel for Marcus Webb and 6 other named residents. She outlined the AG inquiry. She outlined the civil action, which had now been formally filed in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. She outlined the financial conflict of interest in the Midland contract, and she noted, for the record, that the board member most closely associated with the contract revision was present in the room. She did not raise her voice once. Darlene Fitch spoke for 11 minutes. She cited the CC&Rs. She cited her prior HOA experience. She said the community had a problem with declining property values and standards. She had merely been doing her job as a board member by enforcing the governing documents consistently and even-handedly. She used the phrase even-handed enforcement 3 times. Tom Halstead raised his hand and asked whether even-handed enforcement was why. 67 recent violation notices, 33 were against properties whose owners had expressed opposition to Darlene's board positions, while none, not one, had been issued against the property at 16 Sycamore Ridge Lane itself, despite the fact that Darlene's own gutters were visibly clogged with leaves and had been photographed in that condition for the Courier article. Darlene said board members were not subject to self-reporting requirements. Tom said that wasn't what he'd asked. The room had opinions. Greg Whitmore called for order 4 times in 90 seconds. The vote came at the end. It was not a recall vote. The procedural requirements for a formal recall under Section 11. 2 of the CC&Rs required a petition signed by 30% of homeowners and a separately noticed meeting, and they were not there yet. What happened instead was simpler. The board voted on a resolution to suspend enforcement of all violation notices issued since the previous August, pending an independent audit of the complaint records, to retain outside legal counsel to review the Midland contract, to place a moratorium on new violation filings until the audit was complete. The resolution passed 4-1. Darlene Fitch was the one. 2 days later, she submitted her resignation from the board. She did not explain it. There was no letter. Midland Property Services sent a 1-line notification to the board confirming receipt of the resignation. By the time it arrived, Jess Farrell had already called Greg Whitmore for a comment, and Greg Whitmore had said, apparently without fully thinking it through, "I think we all relieved." That quote also ran. The audit took 6 weeks. It was conducted by an independent property management consultant retained by the board, and its findings were presented at the January meeting, a meeting attended by 61 residents, which was still a Birchwood Commons record. The audit found that 71% of violation notices issued in the previous 10 months were substantively deficient, either lacking proper photographic documentation under Section 10.1 of the CC&Rs, citing sections that did not apply to the alleged conduct, or failing to provide the required pre-notice inspection opportunity. It found that the complaint filing pattern was inconsistent with a neutral enforcement posture and suggestive of targeted enforcement against specific properties. Found that the Midland contract revision created a financial incentive misaligned with the board's fiduciary obligations to the community. Board voided all outstanding violation notices issued under Darlene Fitch's tenure that failed the audit's sufficiency review. The total fines voided $18,900 across 44 properties. The civil suit filed by Carla Diaz settled 4 months later. Under the terms of the settlement, which was confidential in its specifics but publicly acknowledged to exist, the Birchwood Commons Community Association agreed to reimburse Marcus Webb for his legal fees and voided fines, adopted a new complaint review procedure, requiring board members to recuse from voting on matters affecting neighboring properties, amended the CC&Rs to require competitive bidding for management contracts and prohibition of performance incentive clauses tied to fine collections. The amendment passed by a vote of 196-4. The AG inquiry concluded with a letter finding that the Birchwood Commons Community Association had engaged in enforcement practices inconsistent with Ohio Revised Code 5312 and recommending adoption of the CC&R amendments already in progress. No criminal charges were filed. The AG's office noted for the record, that the community had substantially remediated the issues identified, which, in the measured language of government correspondence, is about as close to "you people sorted it out yourselves" as it gets. Midland Property Services contract was not renewed. The board hired a new management company, Lakewood Community Services, in March. The new contract had no performance incentive clauses. It had, instead, a clear complaints handling protocol and an explicit prohibition on the management company initiating violation notices without documented, prior approval from the full board. Gerald Toombs, who by spring had developed what his wife called a very strong opinion about Robert's rules of order, ran for board president in the April election and won with 71% of the vote. First act as president was to send a personal letter to every resident who had received a voided violation notice, acknowledging the association's error and expressing regret for the stress caused. The letter ran to 3 paragraphs and was not drafted by an attorney. People noticed. Marcus Webb remained at 14 Sycamore Ridge Lane. He repainted his shutters in 2024. Still Chesapeake gray, still board approved. But he submitted a new AM3 form just to have the paperwork. The hose reel is still mounted to the side of the house. It is still board approved. Priya Okonkwo, who had stood in his driveway in 38-degree weather on the night of the emergency meeting and brought him a thermos of tea he hadn't asked for, became, somewhat inevitably, the association's new architectural review chair. She runs the committee with the mild and cheerful efficiency of someone who believes that governing documents should be read as guidance rather than weaponry, which is an unusual philosophy in HOA governance but appears to be working. Tom Halstead still attends every board meeting. He brings his spreadsheet. The Garcias planted a Japanese maple in their front yard in May. They submitted the appropriate form. Was approved in 4 days. Darlene Fitch listed 16 Sycamore Ridge Lane in February. It sold in March. Nobody from Birchwood Commons attended the open house. After everything Marcus Webb went through, 8 months of manufactured violations, a lawsuit, J inquiry, and a neighbor who called 911 over a house that was never abandoned. Was it worth it? And have you fought your HOA? Did you win? Did you lose? Or did you just walk away? I want every story in the comments. Marcus Webb did not call 911 when Darlene Fitch's moving truck showed up. He did not stand on the lawn with a clipboard. He did not take measurements. He watched from his front window, coffee in hand. When the truck was gone and the driveway at 16 Sycamore Ridge Lane was empty, he went back to his kitchen table and opened his laptop. He still had the spreadsheet. He saved it to a folder labeled closed. Then he made a new tab, left it blank, and titled it just in case. Because in Birchwood Commons, in most of suburban America, if we are being precise about it, the CC&Rs don't expire. The boards change. Personalities rotate in and out of the lower meeting room on Millbrook Road. The binders come and go, but the documents stay. So do the people who know how to read them. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, hit subscribe. There are 214 homes in Birchwood Commons and approximately 40 million homes in HOA-governed communities across the United States. The next story is already filed.